Hi, it's Allison from the Law School Toolbox. Today, I'm excited to have law professor Susan Tanner here with me to talk about the ways that law students can use AI ethically. I'm super excited about this, so welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
Well, to start us off, can you just give listeners some information about your background and your work, just so they have some context here?
Sure. So I'm currently an assistant professor of law at the University of Louisville Brandon School of Law. But before I started teaching, I went to law school, then I went back and I got my PhD in rhetoric from Carnegie Mellon. And so if you know anything about CMU, you know it's a very sort of techie school. And so my PhD was in rhetoric, but I also worked with folks on my dissertation who did corpus and computational linguistics, machine learning, and natural language um, processing. And so my dissertation used all of these methods to analyze legal language. And so yeah, right. So I'll have this sort of
Sounds relevant.
this weird background, sort of quasi techie, very language based sort of sociolinguistics background. And then when ChatGPT started making headlines a few years ago, I was one of the first people to sort of sign up for an account and start using it. And then I did find out that my background was useful for learning how to explain what was going on to non-computer experts, right? So I'm not the machine learning expert, but I work with machine learning enough to sort of know basically how the processes go and especially know what it's doing with the language. And so I started doing some research in the area. I started talking with folks about it, and then it became actually a sort of a bigger part of my research area after that.
Well, it sounds like your timing was amazing. Um, Before we really jump in, I want to touch on something that you just mentioned, which I think has a lot of buzz around it, but people may not actually know what it is. Like, what is ChatGPT and all these other like similar systems? Like, what are they? What are they doing? Why are they useful?
So they are the ones that we're talking about a lot. So we've been talking about generative AI. In other words, there's all sorts of AI. I don't want to bore everyone with all of the AI, but there's sort of there's generative, there's predictive, and there's extractive AI. And the thing that's been getting a lot of news lately has been this generative AI. And so things like ChatGPT um, are working from a large language model, at least the processes that I'm going to talk about. And so what they do is they take a large corpora of language and extract patterns from it. And so after they've extracted those patterns, they can predict and they can sort of generate language patterns that really model the patterns that they've noticed before. And so this is actually how all machine learning works. It looks for patterns in data. When I was working on my dissertation, I fed into it a corpora of legal texts, and it would just sort of pop out some information, right? So it would categorize different texts in different ways so that I could understand something from the large data set that I wouldn't have been able to understand from reading each individual text. And so ChatGPT does this, but pardon the sort of metaphor, but it does it on steroids. So it's doing everything that I did, but better and faster and sort of in real time. In other words, I like to use this sort of explanation to sort of show how ChatGPT works. So it goes through a series of encoding and decoding. In other words, that categorization, coding language based on patterns, and then decoding it and sort of replicating it. But it all does this through language and not through any knowledge of how the world works. And this is one of those places where ChatGPT has also been making headlines because it does things like hallucinate. And I always like to say that the hallucinations are a feature and not a bug. In other words, what we're asking it to do is be creative. We're asking it to give us an answer, even if there's no answer that sort of already exists out there. If we wanted an answer that already existed, we would just go to Google to look for that answer. And so ChatGPT is supposed to, by design, make things up. But when you're expecting it to act like Google, you're going to be disappointed in the results because it'll often give you inaccurate results.
Right. And I know we've all read about like lawyers who've gone. I saw another one the other day in Australia who just sort of go to a chat bot and say, "Oh, give me case law." And it turns out the case law is made up. Important for people to understand that you might get results that are not actually real.
So it's really funny. I'm starting to back off on this a little bit. For the longest time, though, I said I thought of generative AI not as a research tool, but as a writing tool. And so I just never got into trouble because I didn't expect it to do any good research for me. It is actually becoming better at the research part, partially because everyone's building in some sort of an extractive AI as well. So it actually is able to give you real results and know that they're real results. But I do think that if we're expecting it to do research for us, we're going to be sorely disappointed.
All right. Well, tell me a little bit about how you see law students using generative AI in law school right now. Like, what are people doing with this?
So people are doing all sorts of things. Some things great, some things a little problematic. So I've seen law students do everything from ask ChatGPT to write an entire memo or brief for them and turn that in, right? Um,
Hmm.
so not what I would suggest, but also just I've been working with my students with it for about 2.5 years now. And so I've seen it, sort of transform over that time, right? So 2.5 years ago, it was real sort of small. We were working with it in little bits and pieces. Um, and now my students come to me. I work with one else, and my students come to me already having used it for a year or two, increasingly. And so they're doing it. They're using it from everything from the mundane task to as far as law school preparation, briefing cases for them. Creating study schedules, helping with outlines, helping with notes, and also just helping draft, right? Helping with outlines or drafting initial drafts of work that they're going to be turning in.
Nice. And have you seen either the school or people that you've just heard about like actually using this in their jobs, or do you think that's still a little down the road?
So yes, so in those, so like as I sort of think about two parts of legal practice that I engage with regularly. So I work with practitioners. I talk with and work with practitioners. And most people I talk to have already integrated into their practice in some way or another.
Wow.
Yes. So either very formally because their law firms have some sort of a bespoke AI that they've already been using, or as sort of smaller or solo practitioners, some folks have been just using off the shelf ChatGPT to help them write letters, to help them draft correspondence or memos, or even help them with briefs. And so I think on a sort of the day to day, now I will say I might be talking with a very self selected group of people. Right.
Fair.
But the people who come to talk to me just say that they've integrated into their daily lives. I do also, because I do CLEs on AI, I regularly talk with groups of people who have never even tried it and never want to learn it. And so there's that group of practitioners as well. But I think, oh, and I was also going to say that I also work with law professors who I don't think have adopted it at the same sort of rate as practitioners have. They tend to be a little bit more hesitant. And I can understand why. They don't have a reason to do it because they're not working with clients. They're not sort of getting pushback on their billing. And so there might not be as big of a reason to adopt it so quickly. And so that group of sort of legal professionals, I don't think is been adopting it quite at the rate of legal practitioners.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm interested to hear that so many lawyers seem to have kind of picked it up. So what do you think are some kind of good or bad ways, just generally, to use AI or to think about AI as a law student? I mean, some of the things you mentioned, I was kind of like, okay, that makes sense. Other ones like, I don't know. Should you really be using it for your legal writing memo?
So I think that's exactly right. I think, unfortunately, I have a friend who says that law students will go around the world to take a shortcut, right? That
I like that.
right, that everyone's just sort of looking for some way to shortcut, and sometimes it's not very helpful. And so there are ways that you could be using generative AI to shortcut your education that would also shortcut you out of learning. And that's the sort of thing that I would never encourage anyone do. And so that would be things like writing a memo, right? I tell my students all the time, it doesn't, it's not the product of the memo that's going to be important for you to write. It's the process of learning how to write a memo that is going to be important for you. And so having someone or something else draft your memo is not going to help you learn how to write a memo. I also will say the ways that students are currently using it that I think doesn't help with the learning are old methods, right? So in other words, it it's not it's not a new thing to have someone else write a memo for you, right? And just turn it in. That's been going on for years. Obviously, most people don't do it, but it does happen occasionally. I think another sort of problematic thing is having it do too much of your note taking or outlining or summarization for you. Because again, when I talk to my students about outlines, I always tell them, or I like to think about outlining as a verb, right? So, in other words, one outlines their work. It doesn't really matter so much that you have a good outline. And so you could very easily ask ChatGPT to write you a great outline based on your notes. But it's that process of outlining that's helpful. And so this is one of those places where I think it can be used for to shortcut learning. Now, there are all sorts of ways, sort of the busy work that happens with academia that I think generative AI can actually help students. So for example, it takes a while to be able to put together your weekly schedule to figure out when you have things to do, um, to understand what's being asked of you in a particular assignment. And so one thing that I've had my students do is I often give very, very lengthy assignments. I have very lengthy syllabi. And so I'll just have them upload something that I've given them and ask questions about what that assignment is doing for them, right? So my students tend to miss important things in assignments I've given them, and ChatGPT doesn't seem to have missed those same important things.
What would be an example of that? Like a deadline? Or I mean, I'm
So
assuming they look at that.
yes, so a deadline. I was actually just talking with a student today. I have them do this capstone assignment, and sort of hidden within it is a suggested template. And
Mm.
one of my students couldn't find it, sort of that hit because it's a link and it's probably not the easiest thing in the world to find. Um, but ChatGPT could very easily find that I have language that says, if you'd like, you can use, this as a template to start off. And so I mean, it's really those sort of procedural things that it's great with. I've also asked them to write their own checklist. So sometimes I'll give them a checklist of make sure you have this and this and this. But ChatGPT can actually make you a checklist based on an assignment, so that you can make sure before you turn it in, sort of accounted for everything that was asked for.
Huh. That's super interesting. That does seem like it would be useful. Um, and do you feel like in general, I mean, obviously you haven't talked to everyone, but I mean, are law professors in schools kind of open to people using this in those sorts of ways? If it's not like write my memo for me, or are they still very resistant?
So I so I talk to folks on both sides, right? So I'm on a couple of committees for technology or specific to AI. And obviously those professors who sit on those committees with me are very open to AI. I was recently on a university-wide committee where we had to talk about what is acceptable at our university for student use of AI. And the professors who joined that committee were obviously a little bit more open to technology. So there are a handful, but I would say most of the people I talk to, most of the professors I talk to, are very resistant to it for I think a very good reason, which is that same thing that we were just talking about, which is generative AI to be used to substitute for learning. It could also sort of hide when students aren't learning, right? And so one of the reasons that we have grades, one of the reasons that we have assignments is to check in with our students to make sure that they're learning what they need to be learning. And and a good draft or a good, response from generative AI can make it look like a student is learning what they need to learn when they're really not. And so I think more because there are sort of deeper learning needs, a lot of professors have been very hesitant. And this is even true of professors who use it in their own work, right? That they see a difference potentially between having students use it at an early level when they're a 1L or a 2L versus someone who already knows what they're doing and can, sort of coach the generative AI and aren't really trying to learn through this process.
Right. I mean, I think it's similar to sort of canned briefs and that type of thing. That's like, okay, well, you can get, what somebody thought were the five main points of this case, but that's different from you sitting down, reading the case, absorbing through osmosis the way that legal writing is structured, and also deciding that really you think there are six key points and your professor happens to agree or not agree with you. if you short circuit that process in any, whether it's buying a canned brief or having ChatGPT do it for you, of course, you're not learning that process.
Right, I think absolutely, and I also think, there's this I think there's this desire to have easy answers, which, you went to law school and not the point of law school, right?
Right. I feel like the point of law school is actually getting you to understand that if there was an easy answer, no one would be paying you this amount of money to research the
Right,
question. There are no, it's like that we deal in the ambiguity. We don't deal in the cut and dried, or no one would pay for it. You would just look it up.
right, and that's one of those things that unless you're prompting it in a particular way, generative AI is not great at pointing out the fact that there is ambiguity, right? And this is actually one of those places I do research into how good the responses are. And this is one of those places where I think necessarily it's always going to lag behind human reasoning because it's not just that there's ambiguity in the law, but it's also that the law is sort of defined by argument and rational, right? So the sort of human rationality where we have to decide what an audience, a particular judge is willing to accept, right? And there's going to be a disconnect between, the language that generative AI is trained on and making these novel arguments that are potentially able to be picked up in a case or in an opinion, and understanding what arguments are sort of hearable. And so I think the fact that generative AI is not good at this actually should give lawyers a little bit of hope for the future, right? That there's always going to be this sort of human element that goes into it, sort of understanding who your audience is, understanding how to structure an argument so that so that someone will sort of buy into it. And sometimes that's embracing the ambiguity. Sometimes it's talking through it. And again, these are the sorts of things that the new versions of, for example, ChatGPT are getting better at. But I think there's always going to be a little bit of irrationality that goes into making the law. And I don't think that's what we're training these large language models to sort of embrace irrationality.
Interesting. Yeah, I also found maybe, gosh, it's been probably a year ago at this point. I was playing with Claude and just asking it some questions and having it give me some hypos like I was a law student to practice on. And I think it's actually in a lot of ways really good at that. But it made this really fundamental error at one point, and I realized, like, oh, it doesn't have logic. Like, it doesn't understand that there's, the plaintiff and the defendant, and that matters. But it was that moment of like, this doesn't seem right. What's wrong with this? I'm like, oh yeah, this is something that no one L, not a mistake anyone L would ever have made.
Right. And I think that's actually a great lesson, especially because I love I'm a little bit of an optimist when it comes to this, but I love that feature. I love the fact that it can be wrong because I actually, again, if we sort of embrace ambiguity, embrace the fact that part of our role as advocates is to argue and think about multiple sides. I love the fact that you can't trust the answers, right? And in fact, in some ways, I almost like this a little bit better than, some of the horn books or what have you, where you can trust the answers and our sort of our instinct is just to let someone else tell us what the right answer is and not work through that struggle of trying to figure it out for ourselves. And so having ChatGPT create hypos for you, or even potentially do a back and forth Q&A, have it create some multiple choice questions, as long as students know that 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 the technology is fallible, that it could be wrong about things. But in that way, it's much more like a study group, right? Where the point of joining a study group in law school is not to sort of find that one person who really knows what they're doing and understands what's going on in every class and just learning from that person. It's to talk through things. It's because everyone's going to get some things right and some things wrong, and just sort of checking back in. And I think that's one of those ways that ChatGPT can actually be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think kind of developing that gut level of like, huh, really? Like that doesn't seem right. And then diving into it is actually a great learning strategy. The problem, of course, is if people have no context, they just might think like, oh, well, ChatGPT told me, so it must be right. But it may or may not be right.
Well, and I think that's one of the problems with the first year of law school too, right? Because you're so used to being wrong that you're willing to accept to what anyone else or any other thing will tell you is right. And I do think it's hard to develop through that first year where you're just always wrong on a daily basis. learning how to trust yourself. And so I think that's actually maybe where, when we talk at our law school about potentially limiting exposure to students for generative AI in the first year, because again, um, students don't really have enough context to understand when it's giving them good advice, when it's giving them bad advice, and they're sort of everyone just wants to take any advice that they're given, right? I'm sick.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I talk with a lot of 1Ls, and sometimes they come to us for tutoring because they've realized their study group is kind of like ChatGPT. They're like, "Well, these people are really convinced they're right, but I don't know, and they don't know, and maybe you guys could actually be the ones to tell me if something is right or not right, and like help me understand why." We're like, "Yeah, we can do that. We're experts, actually."
Well, exactly, right? I mean, and I think it's really important to know that there are times to go to experts and there's times to sort of figure it out, and to know the difference in the advice that you are getting, right, and where you're getting this from. I say the same thing about students who come to me, right? I want them to come and talk to me and flesh out some ideas, and sometimes I want them to go talk to someone who doesn't know who doesn't know any more than they do, and try and figure it out for themselves, right?
Right, because that's a useful skill set
Yeah.
in life and in legal practice is there's not always gonna be, like, a written answer, because we're developing new case law literally daily.
Yes.
Alright, well, before we wrap up, let's talk through a few scenarios, and some of these I already touched on a little bit, but I just wanna dive into and get a little more detail. So, I ran out of time, I was trying to make an outline, I was gonna study off of it, right before midterms, and I asked ChatGPT to just make it for me. I said, "I'm taking torts, these are the topics we've studied, can you make me an outline?" It seems pretty solid. I mean, should I maybe just do this for all my classes from now on and not waste my own time making them?
So I have a couple of responses to that. So the first one is that law students often feel overwhelmed and are looking for ways to save time. So, as I mentioned, I work with 1Ls during the fall, and my students always tell me that they've decided it's not worth their time to read for class or to outline for exams. and
We hear
right,
these.
and until you've taken your first exam, you really don't know how much of a problem it's going to be if you don't read for class and you don't do your own outlines, right? So for those students, I think doing something is better than nothing. The same thing with my students ask me all the time about commercial outlines. So something is better than nothing. But I certainly don't think I think it's very far from the perfect solution. Because as I mentioned, I do think of outlining as a verb, right? And that it's that process of outlining that you make connections, synthesize rules, and understand the big picture, right? And there's also this term in educational psychology about projective struggle, that actually just taking a little bit more time to learn and think about things is actually very useful. And so a shortcut through the learning process is not going to help anyone really digest and understand that. There was some research a while back about, for example, the importance of just handwriting notes, because it takes a little bit longer, right? There's research back and forth about that, or writing your own study aids sometimes can be helpful. So sometimes just taking a little bit longer with a material is very useful. And so anything that shortcuts the time that you spend with the material is probably not great. But if you have 5 minutes to study, I guess 5 minutes is better than no.
Right. So, I mean, I see it being useful, like I personally, the outlining like as a big written document never really worked well for me. So I made a bunch of flow charts, but I can see, somebody going and saying, okay, I want to do some practice, but I just don't feel like I have a handle on what we've done. Okay, fine. Get a commercial outline on negligence, have ChatGPT write down the elements, but then actually apply them. Something like that I can see being an okay shortcut. I mean, not encouraging it, but I'd rather have someone do that than do nothing.
Right, right, absolutely, and I think that's exactly right. I love one of the uses I love for ChatGPT is to take something in one form and then change it into a form that I want, right? So I
Yeah. From a fan.
and I even, so that could be anything from taking the notes that you've written in class and sort of helping you organize those. Or I love your idea of I'm also a flowchart person. But I can't always figure out what the flow chart should look like, right? In other words, I know there could be a flow chart, but I can't quite make it myself. And I like the idea, and I've actually been experimenting with this pretty recently, about having generative AI help me design flowcharts from
Hmm.
outlines. I've also had it do things like suggest alternate ways to organize my outline, or sort of again providing more. It's almost like you're asking it for feedback rather than you're asking it for the right answer.
Yeah, I can see something like if somebody has an outline and they want to make it shorter, if they need like a 2-page cheat sheet or one of those things that sometimes professors let them bring in, that could be a good starting point. Yeah, I also find, generally speaking, that these tools are much more useful if you give them something and tell them to transform it versus just saying, like, give me this, which could be anything. It might be made up, all of these things. Um, yeah, one of the things that I was going to ask about. So, another scenario, I need to apply for summer jobs and I hate writing cover letters. Can Gen AI help me with this? I think the answer is probably yes. What do you think?
And absolutely. So this is actually one of my favorite uses of generative AI. I do it every day as as a law professor because I have to write a lot of letters. But also, if we sort of understand a little bit about how generative AI works, we also understand that because it's built on this huge corpus of documents and language, it understands the genre. It understands what a letter looks like better than someone who's writing their very first cover letter ever.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah, it's like it has, like, all the knowledge about what, your LinkedIn profile should look like, your cover letter should look like, all of it. It's there.
Yes, and when I don't know about you, but when I had to sit down and write my first set of cover letters for we apply to so many jobs as law students, right? I feel like I just remember thinking I was just sending out so many different cover letters, and I never personalized them when I was a law student. I would for a couple, but I sent out this very generic cover letter,
Yeah.
and this was against all the advice I gave. So all the advice I was given was never send out a generic cover letter. Um, but I just didn't have time to do anything else. And so
Right.
what
I mean, I remember as a 1L applying to in December 1st, 100 probably firm jobs. And those were all generic, like change the address, print it out, put it in the envelope. I mean, you still had to mail it at that point. It took forever. I wasn't going to personalize each one of those. And I think I got one result back from the whole thing.
right? I was saying, and I mean, I was at least fancy enough to be able to. I did a mail merge at the time, but I mean, the same
Oh yeah.
thing, right? And so, but now, we can feed in a job description, have a resume, have a basic your outline of what you want to cover in your cover letter, and you can do a very personalized cover letter for every single job that you want to apply to. And we actually do know that personalized cover letters are better. That the people who read cover letters tend to have not, this is going to sound really rude, but don't have a great imagination. So they want you to really specifically point out that you have the qualities that they've asked for in your cover letter. And so that takes personalization.
Yeah. So I think something like that is a great option of just that kind of menial task and actually making it better. All right, my final scenario. So I'm having trouble finding practice multiple choice questions. I mean, they're on my exam. My professor hasn't really given us very many. Is this something that maybe like the Gen AI can help with?
So I absolutely think that's another place. As long as you're not expecting it to have a right answer, it's a great way to start. Especially as you mentioned before, if we start with something. So if you start with, for example, you're able to find some practice questions on the web, right? And say, oh, but we covered these different topics. Can you adjust it? That I think it actually can do a pretty good job. I'm in the middle of some work looking at how good of a job generative AI does at making up questions and exam questions and hypotheticals, right? From a professor's point of view, and it does an okay job. It especially does a great job with hypotheticals because you don't need to know the law, right? You don't need to know the rules of law to be able to create the hypotheticals. You just need to be able to put in enough issues. And again, generative AI knows what the legal issues are generally, right? It might not be great at the analysis, but it's great at sort of creating an issue spotting hypos for someone.
Yeah, we've experimented a little bit with it. And yeah, the questions are usually better than the answers. But, that's good. But yeah, I think I mean, one of the things I do like about it is if somebody is struggling with a topic area or subtopic, it never gets tired. You can just keep asking questions and ask more and get more hypos and get more questions and really dig into it in a way that I don't think, most professors or TAs or anyone is going to sit there for 4 hours with you and talk about, negligence per se, for example.
Right. I mean, I'm always asking my students, they'll say, "Oh, I didn't understand what that term was." And it used to be a few years ago, I would say, "Well, what did Black's Law tell you it was?"
Right.
And now I just, so we might start with that, but then they'll obviously the answer for one else is, well, I had no idea what Black's Law meant when they said, it meant sex. And so now I say, well, what did generative AI say it was, right? So in other words, you can do things like um, I don't know what proximate cause is. Can you explain it for me? Now explain it to me like I'm a 3-year-old and I could
Right.
potentially understand what's going on here.
Yeah, no, exactly. That kind of like reframing of the same concept in different ways, I think can be helpful. All right, well, we're about out of time. If students want to learn more about this technology, do you have any suggestions? Like what should they be looking at or doing?
So my main suggestion is to use it for things that don't matter. So be really careful. I tell this to everyone I talk to. Incorporate it a little bit into your daily life for things like planning a wardrobe for a week or helping you pack for a trip or helping you plan your meals before you start using it for anything for school, right? Because you don't want to be turning in something that is wrong or problematic. And so just sort of getting to know what it's good at and what it's not good at on these sort of low stakes questions is a good way to start playing with it. And then also, of course, be really careful because not every professor will want you to use generative AI. So you have to make sure that not only do you look at what the policies say, but also check in with your professor before you use it for anything class related, including things that you're not turning in, right? So I know that can be a problem, that even using it to help you study if it's been prohibited by that class, could potentially get a student into trouble. So, those are my sort of two bits of advice. Play with it on the sort of easy, no stakes things. And then before you actually start using it for anything for law school, just check in with your professors to make sure it's okay.
All right, I think that makes a lot of sense. Any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up?
So I don't think so. Other than if I haven't done this before, I think this is sort of an exciting time to be in law school for lots of reasons. But one of those reasons is that I think that the practice of law is going to shift dramatically in the next 5 to 10 years. And so I think for anyone who's in law school right now, it seems like a less scary change than for those who are already practicing.
I think that's a great point. I think people actually have an opportunity to get up to speed, to kind of be the experts on this. And then when they go into practice, they actually have a really valuable skill set of helping other people who might be frightened or whatever actually use this productively. All right. Well, remind us again how people can find out more about you and connect.
So I'm a bit old school. I have my university website, University of Louisville, and you can put Susan Tanner or LinkedIn /Susan Tanner are probably the two best ways to reach me.
Awesome. We will link to both of those. Well, Susan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks everyone for watching, and please subscribe and comment. And check out lawschooltoolbox.com and you can reach out with any questions.